Clara Wilkins' chestnut hair whipped across her face as her heart pounded in her chest, the sound of snorting and hooves scraping the dry earth behind her growing louder with each terrified breath. The wild hogs, at least 6 of them, had appeared from nowhere as she gathered wildflowers near the creek, and now they pursued her with a single-minded determination that turned her blood cold. Wyoming Territory, 1878, was unforgiving to those who underestimated its dangers. Clara had lived her 22 years knowing the risks of frontier life, but nothing had prepared her for the terror of this moment. Her lungs burned as she ran, her skirts clutched in white-knuckled hands, her boots raising dust from the parched summer ground. The distant bluffs where her family's homestead lay seemed impossibly far. "Help!" she screamed, though she knew the chance of anyone hearing was slim. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and her father and brothers had traveled to Laramie for supplies, leaving her alone with her mother, who was too ill to come to her aid. The largest hog, a bristling boar with yellowed tusks, gained ground. Clara could hear its labored breathing, feel the vibration of its charge through the soles of her boots. She'd heard stories of men being gored to death by wild hogs, their bodies torn apart by those savage tusks and powerful jaws. Panic surged through her veins as she realized she wouldn't outrun them. The first shot cracked through the air like thunder, causing Clara to stumble. The second followed almost immediately, and she heard a squeal of pain behind her. She didn't dare look back, didn't dare stop running, even as the sound of hoofbeats different from the hogs approached from her right. "Take my hand," a deep voice commanded. Clara turned her head to see a man on horseback galloping alongside her, his arm extended. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hat, but she could see intense blue eyes locked on hers. Without hesitation, she reached for him as he leaned precariously from his saddle. Their hands connected, and with a strength that took her breath away, he pulled her up and onto his horse in one fluid motion. Clara found herself seated sideways in front of him, his arm secure around her waist, as he wheeled the horse around and spurred it to a gallop away from the pursuing hogs. "Hold on tight," he instructed, his voice close to her ear as she clutched at his shirt. The warmth of his body against hers was a stark contrast to the cold fear that had gripped her moments before. As they thundered across the open plain, Clara caught her first proper glimpse of her rescuer. He was lean but strong, with several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw. Dust and sweat coated his skin, and a small scar crossed his left eyebrow. His clothing marked him as a cowboy worn denim, a faded blue shirt, leather vest, and the distinctive hat that shaded his face from the relentless sun. "Thank you," Clara managed to say, her voice shaky. "Those hogs would have no need to think on it now," he interrupted, his eyes scanning the horizon. "They won't follow us this far. Name's Vaughn Drake." "Clara Wilkins," she replied, suddenly aware of how improper their position was, her body pressed against a stranger's, his arm holding her firmly as the horse carried them across the prairie. Yet given the circumstances, propriety seemed a trivial concern. "Where were you headed, Miss Wilkins?" Vaughn asked, slowing his horse to a more manageable trot once he was certain they'd outrun the danger. "My family's homestead," she said, pointing toward the distant bluffs. "It's about 3 miles that way." Vaughn nodded, adjusting their course. "Lucky I was passing through. Those hogs have been causing trouble for ranchers all through this territory. I've been tracking them for 2 days." "You hunt wild hogs?" Clara asked, studying him more carefully. He didn't look like a professional hunter, but there was something capable in the way he handled himself, something confident in his posture. "Not typically," Vaughn replied with a slight smile that transformed his weathered face. I work cattle for the Rocking J Ranch over in Big Horn Basin. Mr. Jenkins, that's my boss, sent me to deal with the hogs after they destroyed one of our grazing pastures and injured 2 good horses. As they rode, Clara became increasingly aware of every place their bodies connected: his chest against her shoulder, his arm around her waist, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Despite the lingering fear from the chase, a different kind of nervousness fluttered in her stomach. "What brought you out alone?" Vaughn asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "I was gathering wildflowers for my mother," Clara explained, sudden grief tightening her throat. "She's been ill and the doctor in town said there's not much more he can do." "The flowers cheer her, though." Vaughn's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. My own mother passed when I was 15. Consumption." "I fear that's what's taking mine," Clara whispered. They fell silent again, but it was a different quiet one of shared understanding rather than awkwardness. The prairie stretched around them, golden grasses rippling in the breeze beneath a vast blue sky. In the distance, Clara could make out the outline of her family's modest cabin and barn nestled against the bluffs. "That's home," she said, pointing. Vaughn nodded and guided his horse toward the homestead. As they approached, Clara saw her mother appear in the doorway, concern evident even at a distance. "Clara," her mother called, her voice thin but audible as Vaughn brought the horse to a stop in front of the cabin. "What happened?" "Wild hogs, Mama," Clara explained as Vaughn helped her down from the horse, his hands strong at her waist. "This is Mr. Drake. He saved me." Catherine Wilkins was a thin shadow of her former self, her skin pallid and drawn tight over her bones, but her eyes were bright as she extended a trembling hand to Vaughn. "Thank you for bringing my daughter home safely, Mr. Drake." Vaughn removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "It was my pleasure, Mrs. Wilkins. Your daughter was remarkably brave." Clara felt her cheeks warm at his praise. "Would you stay for dinner, Mr. Drake? It's the least we can offer after what you did." Vaughn hesitated, looking toward the horizon where the sun was beginning its descent. "I should get back to tracking those hogs before nightfall. Please," Catherine insisted. "My husband and sons won't return until tomorrow." "I'd feel better knowing there was a man here overnight, with those beasts roaming about. We have a spare bed in the barn." Something in her mother's tone made Clara glance at her sharply. There was a hint of matchmaking in Catherine's weak smile that both embarrassed and amused her. Clearly, near-death experience or not, her mother hadn't missed the opportunity presented by a handsome cowboy's timely arrival. Vaughn seemed to consider the request, then nodded. "I suppose those hogs won't get far in the dark." "If you're certain it's no trouble, I'd be grateful for a hot meal and a place to rest." "No trouble at all," Clara assured him, trying to ignore the flutter in her chest at the prospect of his extended company. "I'll tend to your horse if you'd like to wash up. The pump is just around the side of the house." Vaughn handed her the reins, their fingers brushing momentarily. "Thank you, Miss Wilkins." As Clara led his horse to the barn, she couldn't help but reflect on the strange turn her day had taken. Hours ago, she'd been peacefully gathering flowers. Then she'd faced death in the form of charging tusks and hooves, only to be swept away by a man whose blue eyes seemed to see right through her. Inside the barn, as she removed the saddle and began brushing down Vaughn's horse, a beautiful chestnut gelding with a white blaze, Clara heard her mother's cough echoing from the cabin. The familiar sound sent a pang through her heart. Soon, she knew, there would be no more coughing, no more pain for Catherine. But Clara would be left alone to care for her father and brothers, to maintain their home while they worked the land. "Need any help?" She turned to find Vaughn standing in the barn doorway, his face freshly washed, hat in hand. For a moment, she simply stared at him, struck by how different he looked with the trail dust gone. Younger, perhaps though still older than her by several years and impossibly handsome. "I've got it," she replied, finding her voice. "You've done enough heroics for one day." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Doesn't seem right to let a lady tend my horse after she's had such a fright." "This lady grew up on a homestead," Clara countered, continuing to brush the gelding's coat. "I've been caring for horses since I could walk." Vaughn chuckled and stepped into the barn, moving to stand beside her. He reached out to pat the horse's neck. "Thunder here is usually wary of strangers. He seems to like you, though." "Thunder," Clara raised an eyebrow. "That's his name, named him after the first storm we weathered together," Vaughn explained. "We were caught out on the range. Lightning struck a tree not 50 yards from us, and this fellow didn't even flinch. Just stood there like he was enjoying the show." Clara smiled, running her hand along Thunder's smooth neck. "A brave one, then." "Like his rider," Vaughn said with a wink that made her heart skip. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks and busied herself with hanging up the brush. "I should help Mama with dinner. Make yourself comfortable, Mr. Drake." "Vaughn," he corrected gently. "After sharing a saddle, I think we can dispense with formalities, don't you?" Clara met his eyes and found them warm with something she couldn't quite name. "Vaughn, then," she agreed softly. As she walked back to the cabin, she could feel his gaze on her back. And despite the lingering fear from her encounter with the wild hogs, despite her mother's illness and the weight of responsibility that had settled on her young shoulders, Clara felt a spark of something new and unexpected, something that felt remarkably like hope. Dinner was a simple affair: rabbit stew that Clara had prepared that morning before going out to gather flowers, cornbread made with the last of their meal, and precious preserves from last summer's berries. Catherine sat at the table with them but ate little, her appetite diminished by her illness. Still, she seemed animated by Vaughn's presence, asking him questions about his work and his travels. "Where do you hail from originally, Mr. Drake?" Catherine asked, her thin fingers wrapped around a cup of herbal tea. "Virginia, madam," Vaughn replied. "My father had a small farm there, but after the war, there wasn't much left. He passed a few years after returning home. My brother took what remained of the land, and I headed west to make my own way." "The war took so much from so many," Catherine said softly. "My husband William fought as well, though he doesn't speak of it often." Clara watched Vaughn's expression tighten slightly at the mention of the conflict that had torn the nation apart, wondering what memories haunted him. He would have been just a boy when the war ended, but its aftermath had clearly shaped his path. "How long have you been in Wyoming territory?" Clara asked, steering the conversation to safer ground. "Going on 5 years now," Vaughn answered, visibly relaxing. "Started as a trail hand, driving cattle up from Texas. Worked my way up to where Mr. Jenkins trusts me with more responsibility. One day I hope to have a spread of my own." "A worthy ambition," Catherine nodded approvingly. "A man should have land of his own." Clara caught her mother's meaningful glance and fought the urge to roll her eyes. Catherine had been dropping hints about Clara finding a husband since her 20th birthday, concerned that her only daughter would be left alone once she passed. The arrival of an unmarried cowboy who had heroically saved Clara's life was like something from one of the dime novels her youngest brother secretly read. After dinner, Catherine retired early, her strength depleted by the simple act of sitting at the table. Clara busied herself with clearing away the dishes while Vaughn insisted on bringing in more firewood and water for the morning. When the chores were done, Clara found herself sitting with Vaughn on the cabin's small porch, watching as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear in the vast Wyoming darkness. The night was cool but not uncomfortable, the air fragrant with sage and the lingering warmth of summer. "Your mother seems like a strong woman," Vaughn said after a comfortable silence. "She is," Clara agreed, her throat tightening. "She's held us together through everything, the journey west, building this place, the hard winters, all of it. I don't know what we'll do without her." Vaughn's hand found hers in the darkness, a gentle pressure that offered comfort without presumption. "You'll carry on because that's what she taught you to do, and you'll remember her every time you see wildflowers." Clara blinked back tears, touched by his understanding. "You speak like someone who knows what it's like." "Loss has a way of teaching hard lessons," Vaughn replied, his voice low. "But it also shows you what matters." "Who matters?" Their eyes met in the dim light spilling from the cabin window, and Clara felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, or a possibility neither had expected to find. For a moment she thought he might lean closer, might bridge the small space that separated them on the porch steps. Instead, Vaughn gently released her hand and stood. "I should turn in if I'm going to get an early start on those hogs tomorrow." Clara nodded, both relieved and disappointed. "Of course. There are extra blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed in the barn. The nights can get chilly." "I appreciate your hospitality," Vaughn said, settling his hat back on his head. "And your company." "Good night, Vaughn," Clara replied softly. "Good night, Clara." She watched him walk toward the barn, his silhouette tall against the star-filled sky, and wondered at the strange twist of fate that had brought him into her life. Tomorrow he would hunt the wild hogs and then ride away, back to his life on the rocking J. And she would return to her duties here, caring for her mother, waiting for her father and brothers to return, continuing the endless work of survival on the frontier. Yet something told her that this would not be the last time their paths crossed. Something in the way he had looked at her, in the gentle pressure of his hand on hers, suggested that Vaughn Drake might find reason to ride this way again. With that thought warming her heart, Clara went inside to check on her mother before seeking her own bed. Morning came with the first tentative rays of sun creeping through Clara's window. She rose quickly, dressing in a simple work dress and pinning her hair into a practical bun. Her mother was still sleeping, her breathing shallow but steady, so Clara moved quietly through the cabin, stoking the fire and putting coffee on to boil. Outside, she found Vaughn already awake, leading thunder from the barn. He'd clearly been up for some time. His face was freshly shaved, his clothing neat despite the wear. He looked like a man with purpose, ready to face whatever the day might bring. "You're up early," she greeted him, surprised by how pleased she was to see him. "Always have been," he replied with a smile. "Comes with the territory when you work cattle. I checked your fence line at first light, it's solid, but those hogs could still cause trouble if they're determined enough." Clara nodded, touched by his concern. "Would you like some coffee before you go?" "It's just about ready." "I wouldn't say no to that," Vaughn agreed, tying Thunder to the hitching post. They sat together at the small table, steam rising from their cups in the cool morning air. The simplicity of the moment, sharing coffee with this man she'd known for less than a day, felt strangely significant to Clara, as if they were establishing a ritual that might one day become familiar. "What will you do after you've dealt with the hogs?" she asked, cradling her cup between her hands. Vaughn considered the question, his blue eyes thoughtful. "Head back to the rocking J, I suppose. Mr. Jenkins has a herd that needs moving to winter pasture soon." "I see," Clara said, trying to keep disappointment from her voice. "Though," Vaughn added, meeting her gaze directly, "I find myself thinking I might have reason to ride through these parts again, if that would be welcome." Clara felt warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the coffee. "It would," she replied simply. A cough from the bedroom reminded Clara of her mother's presence and her duties. She rose from the table, setting down her cup. "I should check on Mama. She has good days and bad days lately." Vaughn nodded in understanding. "I won't keep you then. Thank you for the coffee and for your hospitality." He stood as well, reaching for his hat. Clara walked with him to the door, suddenly reluctant to see him go, aware that once he left, the magic of their unexpected meeting might dissipate like morning mist under the harsh Wyoming sun. "Be careful with those hogs," she said. "They're more dangerous than they look." "I will," Vaughn promised. He hesitated, then reached out to take her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "Take care of yourself too, Clara Wilkins. Your mother isn't the only one who needs you strong." Before she could respond, the sound of hoofbeats approaching drew their attention. Clara stepped onto the porch to see a cloud of dust in the distance, resolving into 3 riders approaching at a brisk pace. "That's my father and brothers," she said, recognizing their silhouettes even at a distance. "They weren't supposed to be back until this afternoon." Vaughn nodded, releasing her hand and stepping back slightly, a gesture of respect that Clara appreciated, though she found herself missing his touch immediately. William Wilkins was a tall, stern man with a face weathered by sun and hardship. He pulled his horse to a stop in front of the cabin, his keen eyes taking in the scene before him, his daughter standing near a stranger, the man's horse saddled and ready to ride. "Clara," he greeted, his voice carrying a question. "Pa," she replied, stepping forward. "This is Mr. Vaughn Drake. He works for the Rocking J Ranch. Yesterday I was chased by wild hogs while gathering flowers for Mama, and Mr. Drake saved me. Mama invited him to stay the night." William dismounted, followed by Clara's brothers Thomas, 24 and serious like their father, and Joseph, 19 and full of restless energy. Both eyed Vaughn with the natural suspicion of men encountering a stranger near their womenfolk. "Mr. Drake," William said, extending his hand. "Seems we owe you our thanks." Vaughn shook the offered hand firmly. "No thanks needed, sir. Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone would have been able," William countered, assessing the younger man with experienced eyes. "Those hogs have been a menace across 3 counties. You said you work for the Rocking J." "Yes, sir. Mr. Jenkins sent me to track the hogs after they damaged some of our grazing land." William nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation. "Jenkins is a good man. We've done business with him before." Clara watched the exchange with interest, noting how Vaughn held himself respectful but not deferential, meeting her father's gaze directly. There was an ease about him, a quiet confidence that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. "Mr. Drake was just leaving to continue tracking the hogs," Clara explained. "Alone?" Thomas asked, frowning. "That's a job for at least 3 men, Vaughn shrugged. "I've tracked worse with less help." William studied the cowboy for a moment longer, then turned to his sons. "Unload the supplies and see to the horses. Then get your rifles." To Vaughn, he said, "If you're willing to wait an hour, you'll have help tracking those beasts. They nearly took my daughter. I've got a score to settle." Something like relief flickered in Vaughn's eyes, though his expression remained calm. "I'd welcome the company, Mr. Wilkins, and the local knowledge." "Good," William nodded decisively. "Clara, check on your mother." "We brought medicine from town. The doctor had a new tonic he thought might ease her breathing." As Clara's brothers began unloading their packs, Vaughn stepped closer to her, his voice low. "I'll come back when it's done." It wasn't a question, and Clara didn't treat it as one. "I'll have supper waiting," she promised. His smile was quick but warm. "Something to look forward to then." Clara watched as he went to help her brothers, his movements easy and confident as he introduced himself properly to Thomas and Joseph. There was something fascinating about seeing him integrate so naturally into her family's routines, as if he belonged there. Inside, she found her mother awake and sitting up in bed, her face drawn with pain but her eyes alert. "Was that your father I heard?" Catherine asked. "Yes, Mama." "They're back early," Clara confirmed, sitting on the edge of the bed and taking her mother's frail hand. "Pa brought medicine from the doctor in town." Catherine nodded, then a knowing smile crossed her lips. "And is your cowboy still here?" Clara felt her cheeks warm. "He's not my cowboy, Mama." "Not yet, perhaps," Catherine replied with a hint of her old spirit. "But I saw how he looked at you last night and how you looked back. A mother knows these things." "He's going with Pa and the boys to hunt the wild hogs," Clara said, changing the subject. "He said he'd come back afterward." Catherine squeezed her daughter's hand weakly. "Good, I like him, Clara. He has kind eyes and strong hands. A woman could do worse on the frontier." "Mama," Clara protested, though she couldn't help smiling. "I've known him for less than a day." "Sometimes that's all it takes," Catherine said softly, her gaze distant with memory. "I knew your father was the one the moment he helped me up after I slipped in the mud outside the general store in Virginia. Sometimes fate has a way of throwing the right person in your path, or in your case, pulling you onto their saddle." Clara laughed despite herself. "We'll see, Mama. Now, let me get you some tea and that new medicine Pa brought." As she busied herself with caring for her mother, Clara could hear the men outside preparing for their hunt. Her father's deep voice, her brother's quicker responses, and occasionally Vaughn's measured tones. There was a part of her that worried for all of them. Wild hogs were unpredictable and dangerous. But she took comfort in knowing they would be together, watching out for one another. By the time she returned to the porch, the men were mounted and ready to ride. Vaughn tipped his hat to her, his eyes holding a promise that warmed her from within. Her father nodded solemnly, and her brothers waved as they rode out, following the trail that led toward the creek where Clara had first encountered the hogs. Clara watched until they disappeared from sight, then turned back to the cabin with a mixture of emotions swirling in her chest: concern for their safety, hope for their return, and beneath it all, a budding feeling for the blue-eyed cowboy who had charged into her life so unexpectedly. The day stretched long before her, filled with the usual chores that kept a homestead functioning: feeding the chickens, tending the small garden, preparing food, and caring for her mother. Yet Clara found her thoughts repeatedly returning to Vaughn, wondering what kind of man he truly was beyond the brief glimpses she'd been afforded. He was brave. Certainly that much had been proven by his rescue. Kind, too, judging by his gentle manner with her mother. There was an intelligence in his eyes that suggested he thought deeply about the world around him. But what dreams drove him? What sorrows had shaped him? These were questions that could only be answered with time, if fate granted them that opportunity. As afternoon faded toward evening, Clara began preparing a hearty stew, hoping the men would return hungry and successful. Her mother rested, the new medicine seeming to ease her breathing somewhat, though Clara harbored no illusions about its ability to reverse Catherine's decline. The sound of approaching horses pulled Clara from her thoughts. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, her heart quickening at the sight of 4 riders returning. Relief washed over her as she counted each familiar figure: her father, her brothers, and Vaughn, all apparently unharmed. As they drew closer, Clara could see that their clothing was mudded and there was blood on Joseph's sleeve, but her quick assessment confirmed it wasn't serious. Behind them, tied to Thomas's horse, was the carcass of a large boar. "You got them," she called as they approached. Her father dismounted, his expression grim but satisfied. Got the big one and 2 others. The rest scattered. They won't be back, not to this valley at least. Vaughn swung down from Thunder, his movements slightly stiff, suggesting the day's exertion had taken a toll. Your father's an excellent shot, he said, approaching Clara. And your brothers know this land like the backs of their hands. Made my job a lot easier. Joseph got a scratch, William said, nodding toward his youngest son. Nothing serious, but you'd better clean it. Come inside, all of you, Clara invited. Stew's almost ready and I can tend to that cut. The men followed her into the cabin, bringing with them the scents of horses, gunpowder, and the wild prairie. Clara busied herself gathering clean cloths, and the bottle of whiskey her father kept for medicinal purposes, while the men washed up outside at the pump. Joseph winced as Clara cleaned the long scratch on his arm, clearly made by a tusk that had come too close for comfort. You're lucky it's not worse, she chided gently, applying a salve of her mother's making. Should have seen Vaughn, Joseph replied with boyish admiration. That big boar charged straight at him and he didn't even flinch. Just waited till it was almost on him before putting a bullet right between its eyes. Clara glanced at Vaughn, who was sitting at the table talking quietly with her father. Is that so? Man's got nerves of steel, Joseph confirmed. Pa was impressed too, though he won't say it out loud. That was high praise indeed. William Wilkins was not easily impressed, especially by outsiders. Clara finished bandaging Joseph's arm and turned her attention to the stew, adding dumplings to the simmering pot. Catherine emerged from her bedroom, wrapped in a shawl despite the warmth of the evening. William immediately went to her side, his weathered face softening as he helped her to a chair. You should be resting, he murmured, but there was no real reproach in his voice. I've rested all day, Catherine replied. I wanted to hear about your hunt. Her eyes found Vaughn across the room, and to visit with our guest while I'm still able. The simple statement hung in the air, a reminder of what they all knew but rarely spoke aloud, that Catherine's time was limited, measured now in weeks or perhaps months, but certainly not years. Dinner was a lively affair, despite the undercurrent of awareness about Catherine's condition. The men recounted their hunt, each adding details to create a full picture of the day's adventure. Clara watched as Vaughn integrated seamlessly into the family dynamic, deferring to her father's authority while contributing his own observations, laughing at Joseph's exaggerated descriptions and nodding at Thomas's more measured account. Most striking to Clara was how he included her mother in the conversation, directing comments to Catherine and listening attentively to her responses, treating her not as an invalid, but as the heart of the family she had always been. It was a kindness that spoke volumes about his character. After the meal, as Clara began clearing the dishes, Catherine motioned Vaughn closer. Mr. Drake, she said, her voice thin but determined, I want to thank you properly for saving my daughter. In this world, especially out here, a moment's hesitation can mean the difference between life and death. You didn't hesitate. Vaughn ducked his head slightly, seemingly uncomfortable with the praise. As I told Mr. Wilkins, anyone would have done the same. Perhaps, Catherine conceded, but not everyone would have succeeded. Clara is precious to us, our only daughter, the one who keeps this family together. What you preserved yesterday was more than just her life. Clara paused in her work, touched by her mother's words and the emotion behind them. She saw Vaughn glance in her direction, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. She strikes me as the type who would have found a way to survive regardless, he said finally. But I'm glad I was there to make it easier. William, who had been quietly smoking his pipe by the fire, spoke up. Jenkins will be expecting you back at the Rocking J. It wasn't a question, but Vaughn answered it as one. "Yes, sir, though I've completed the task he sent me for." William puffed thoughtfully. "We're short-handed here with harvest coming. Could use an extra pair of hands for a week or two if Jenkins could spare you. Pay wouldn't be much, but there'd be room and board." Clara nearly dropped the plate she was drying, stunned by her father's offer. William Wilkins was not a man who easily invited strangers into his home or his business. That he would suggest such an arrangement with Vaughn spoke volumes about the impression the cowboy had made. Vaughn seemed equally surprised, though he hid it well. "That's generous, Mr. Wilkins. I'd need to ride back to let Mr. Jenkins know, but I believe he'd agree, especially as a favor to a neighbor." "Good," William nodded decisively. "You can head out in the morning and return when you've settled it with Jenkins." Clara caught her mother's eye across the room and saw the satisfaction there. Catherine had clearly had a hand in this development, though how she'd convinced her husband was a mystery. Perhaps William had seen for himself what Catherine had observed, that there was something special developing between Clara and the cowboy who had saved her. Later, as the household prepared for sleep, Clara found herself alone with Vaughn on the porch once more. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky, the air cool but pleasant. "Your father's offer was unexpected," Vaughn said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "For me as well," Clara admitted. "He doesn't usually take to strangers so quickly." Vaughn smiled, the expression visible even in the dim light spilling from the cabin windows. "And what about you, Clara Wilkins? Do you take to strangers quickly?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning that went beyond the teasing tone. Clara considered her answer carefully. "Not usually," she said finally, meeting his gaze. "But then, I haven't had many strangers pull me onto their saddle and away from charging wild hogs. That tends to create a certain bond." Vaughn laughed softly, the sound warm in the quiet night. "I suppose it does at that." He stepped closer, and Clara found herself holding her breath, her heart suddenly racing as it had during her flight from the Hogs, though for entirely different reasons. Vaughn's hand came up to gently brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch feather light against her skin. "I'll come back," he promised, his voice low. "Not just because your father offered work, but because there's something here I haven't found elsewhere." "And what's that?" Clara whispered, scarcely able to form the words with him standing so close. "A beginning," Vaughn replied simply. Then, with a restraint that Clara found both admirable and frustrating, he stepped back, returning to a proper distance. "Good night, Clara. I'll see you in a few days." "Good night, Vaughn," she replied, watching as he walked toward the barn for his second night under their roof. Clara slept fitfully that night, her dreams a confused jumble of charging hogs, galloping horses, and blue eyes that seemed to see straight into her soul. Morning came too quickly, the first light of dawn finding her already awake and dressing for the day. By the time she reached the kitchen, Vaughn was already there, hat in hand, speaking quietly with her father. They both looked up as she entered, and something in Vaughn's expression made her heart skip. "Good morning," she greeted them, busying herself with the coffee pot to hide the flush she felt rising to her cheeks. "Mr. Drake is heading out," her father informed her, though the statement was unnecessary. "Should be back in 3 days or so, depending on what Jenkins says." Clara nodded, pouring coffee for the men and herself. "Safe travels, then." William accepted his cup with a nod of thanks, then excused himself to check on Catherine, leaving Clara and Vaughn alone in the kitchen. "I meant what I said last night," Vaughn said once her father was out of earshot. "I'm coming back." Clara met his gaze steadily. "I believe you." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, a promise, a possibility. Then Vaughn set down his empty cup and reached for his hat. 3 days, he said. Try not to get chased by any more wild animals while I'm gone. Clara smiled, the tension broken by his teasing. I'll do my best, but no promises. This is Wyoming, after all. Vaughn's answering smile was quick and warm. Then, with a tip of his hat, he was gone, the sound of Thunder's hooves fading into the distance as Clara stood in the doorway watching him ride away. The next 3 days passed with agonizing slowness for Clara. She threw herself into her work helping her brothers with the early harvest, caring for her mother, preserving vegetables from the garden, all the endless tasks that filled a woman's day on the frontier. Yet her thoughts constantly returned to Vaughn, wondering if he would truly come back, if his boss would spare him, if the connection she felt was real or merely a product of their dramatic meeting. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, as Clara was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin, her youngest brother's voice called out from the fields, "Rider coming." Clara's heart leapt, but she forced herself to continue her task, methodically pinning each item to the line even as her eyes strained toward the horizon. Gradually, the rider came into focus, a familiar figure on a chestnut horse, moving at an easy lope across the prairie. Vaughn had returned. Clara finished hanging the last sheet, then walked around to the front of the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. She wanted to run to meet him, to show the joy she felt at his return, but propriety and the knowledge of her family's watchful eyes kept her steps measured, her expression composed. Vaughn dismounted as he reached the yard, leading Thunder toward her with a smile that reached his eyes. "Miss Wilkins," he greeted her, tipping his hat. "Mr. Drake," she replied, unable to keep an answering smile from her lips. "I see you made it back in one piece." "As promised," he confirmed. "Mr. Jenkins sends his regards to your father and says he can spare me for 2 weeks, possibly 3 if the work at the Rocking J allows." Clara's heart soared at the news, though she kept her voice even. "Pa will be pleased. We've got plenty to keep you busy with the harvest coming in." Vaughn nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "I brought something for you," he said, reaching into his saddlebag. "Saw it in town and thought you might like it." He withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Clara accepted it with surprise, her fingers brushing his in the exchange. "You didn't have to bring me anything," she said, touched by the gesture. "I wanted to," Vaughn replied simply. "Go ahead, open it." Clara carefully untied the string and unwrapped the paper to reveal a small book of poetry Tennyson, well worn but in good condition, its leather binding smooth beneath her fingertips. "It's beautiful," she breathed, opening the cover to leaf through the pages. "Thank you." "The shopkeeper said it came all the way from Boston," Vaughn explained. "Thought you might enjoy something to read during the long winter evenings." The thoughtfulness of the gift moved Clara deeply. Books were precious on the frontier, especially volumes of poetry rather than practical guides or religious texts. That Vaughn had chosen something to nourish her mind and spirit rather than a practical item spoke volumes about his perception of her. "I'll treasure it," she assured him, clutching the book to her chest. William emerged from the barn, nodding a greeting to Vaughn. "Drake, good to see you back. Jenkins agreed then?" "Yes, sir," Vaughn confirmed, shifting his attention to her father. "Said he could spare me for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer." "Good," William nodded, all business. "We're bringing in the west field tomorrow. You can bunk in the barn again. Thomas will show you where everything is." Clara watched as her father led Vaughn toward the fields, already discussing the work ahead. The cowboy glanced back over his shoulder, catching her eye with a smile that seemed meant just for her, before turning his attention to William's instructions. That evening, Vaughn joined the family for dinner, taking the same seat he had occupied days before. The conversation flowed easily, focusing mainly on the harvest and the work to be done. Clara noticed how her brothers had already accepted Vaughn's presence, including him in their plans and discussions, as if he'd always been part of their team. Catherine watched it all with knowing eyes, her gaze occasionally meeting Clara's with a hint of pleased conspiracy. It was clear to Clara that her mother approved of the developing situation, seeing in Vaughn the kind of man she would want for her daughter, strong, capable, kind, and with a gentle manner that belied his frontier toughness. After dinner, as had become their custom, Clara and Vaughn found themselves on the porch while the rest of the family settled inside. The evening was mild, the last warmth of summer lingering in the air as crickets chirped in the tall grass beyond the yard. "How is your mother?" Vaughn asked, his voice low with genuine concern. Clara sighed, leaning against the porch railing. "No better, no worse. The new medicine helps with the pain, but we all know it's just a matter of time." She paused, then added softly, "She likes you, you know." Vaughn smiled at that. "I'm glad." "I like her too. She reminds me of my own mother. Strong, even in weakness." "What was she like, your mother?" Clara asked, realizing how little she knew about his past despite the strong connection she felt to him. Vaughn was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "She was beautiful," he said finally. "Not in the way ladies in fancy dresses in Richmond were beautiful, but in her own way. She had dark hair like mine and green eyes that could see right through a lie. Worked from dawn to dusk every day of her life, but still found time to read to us at night, me and my brother." "She sounds wonderful," Clara said softly. "She was," Vaughn agreed. "She held our family together during the war when my father was away fighting. Kept us fed somehow, though God knows it couldn't have been easy." He paused, his expression distant with memory. "When the consumption took her, it was like the light went out of our home. My father was never the same. The war had already changed him, but losing her broke something in him that couldn't be fixed." Clara reached out impulsively, covering his hand with hers where it rested on the porch railing. "I'm sorry." Vaughn turned his hand to clasp hers, his touch warm and reassuring despite the sadness of his reminiscence. "It was a long time ago, but it taught me something important, that life is precious and short, and that finding joy where you can is not just a luxury but a necessity." His eyes met hers in the gathering darkness, and Clara felt the truth of his words resonate within her. Her mother was dying. This life on the frontier was hard and often cruel. Yet in this moment, with Vaughn's hand holding hers and his eyes reflecting the first stars appearing in the evening sky, Clara felt a happiness that transcended the difficulties surrounding them. "I've been thinking," Vaughn said after a moment, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "After the harvest, I'll have to go back to the Rocking J. I gave my word to Jenkins and he's been good to me. But I'd like to come back here if you'd welcome it. Not just to visit, but with purpose." Clara's heart quickened at his words. What purpose would that be? Vaughn's fingers tightened slightly around hers. "To court you properly, Clara Wilkins, with your father's permission and in accordance with all the proprieties your mother would expect." Though she had sensed the direction of his feelings, the directness of his statement took Clara's breath away. They had known each other less than a week, yet it felt right in a way she couldn't explain, as if the connection between them had been forged in the intensity of their first meeting and tempered by the honesty of their subsequent interactions. "I would welcome that," she replied, her voice steady despite the fluttering of her heart. "Very much." Vaughn's smile in response was like sunrise breaking over the prairie, warm, bright, and full of promise. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned closer. Clara held her breath as his free hand came up to gently cup her cheek, his touch reverent against her skin. The kiss, when it came, was gentle, a question rather than a demand, a promise rather than a claim. Clara had been kissed before, awkward pecks from boys at church socials that had left her wondering what the fuss was about. This was entirely different, a connection that seemed to reach beyond the physical touch to something deeper, something that resonated in her very soul. When they parted, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers for a moment, his breath warm against her lips. "I've wanted to do that since the moment I pulled you onto Thunder's back," he admitted softly. Clara laughed, the sound bright with happiness. "Even with wild hogs charging and me covered in dust and fear." "Even then," Vaughn confirmed, his smile evident in his voice. "Maybe especially then. You were so brave, so alive. I knew right then that you were someone special." The sound of the cabin door opening caused them to step apart quickly, though Clara suspected their flushed faces told their own story. It was Joseph, mercifully oblivious as only a 19-year-old boy could be. "Pa wants to know if you've checked the irrigation channel by the west field," he said to Vaughn. "Says if not, we should do it now before it gets too dark." Vaughn nodded, composing himself. "I'll come help. Best to be prepared for tomorrow." As he followed Joseph toward the fields, Vaughn glanced back at Clara, his eyes holding a promise that made her feel warm despite the cooling evening air. She touched her lips gently, still feeling the impression of his kiss, and knew that whatever happened in the days and weeks ahead, her life had changed irrevocably from the moment that wild hogs had chased her across the Wyoming prairie. The harvest days that followed fell into a rhythm of hard work and shared purpose. Vaughn integrated seamlessly into the Wilkins family's routines, rising before dawn with the men to bring in the crops, working alongside them through the heat of the day, and joining the family circle in the evenings. Clara watched him with her father and brothers, how he listened to William's instructions without defensiveness, how he shared his own knowledge of land and animals when it was relevant, how he teased Joseph good-naturedly and discussed serious matters with Thomas as equals. More precious to Clara were the moments they managed to steal together, walking to check the chicken coop, sitting on the porch after dinner, riding side by side to deliver part of the harvest to a neighboring farm. In these intervals, they talked of everything and nothing: their pasts, their hopes, the books they'd read, the places they'd seen or dreamed of seeing. With each conversation, each shared laugh or moment of comfortable silence, the connection between them deepened. Catherine observed their blossoming relationship with evident satisfaction, often arranging for them to have time alone together, sending Clara to the creek to wash linens when she knew Vaughn would be watering the horses, asking them both to gather eggs or pick late vegetables from the garden. These tasks were transparent excuses, but Clara was grateful for her mother's tacit approval and facilitation. A week into Vaughn's stay, as Clara was kneading bread dough in the kitchen, Catherine approached her, moving slowly with the aid of a walking stick. "He's a good man," she said without preamble, easing herself into a chair at the table. Clara couldn't pretend not to understand. "Yes, he is," she agreed, continuing to work the dough with flour-covered hands. "Your father thinks so too, though he'd never say it outright," Catherine continued. "He's impressed by how Vaughn works, how he respects the land and the animals." Clara glanced at her mother, curious about the direction of the conversation. "I'm glad Pa approves." Catherine smiled, a hint of her old mischief lighting her tired eyes. "Approves enough that when Vaughn asked for permission to court you properly, your father didn't run him off with a shotgun." Clara's hands stilled in the dough. "Vaughn spoke to Pa already." "Yesterday," Catherine confirmed. "Did it properly too, asked for a private word, stated his intentions clearly, assured your father he could provide for you." Warmth spread through Clara's chest at the knowledge that Vaughn had followed through on his promise so quickly and formally. And Pa said yes. He said Vaughn could court you with the understanding that any formal engagement would wait until you'd known each other at least 6 months, Catherine replied, which I thought was quite reasonable of him, considering how he usually glowers at any man who looks your way twice. Clara laughed, resuming her kneading with renewed vigor. I suppose I should be grateful he didn't insist on a year. He sees how you look at each other, Catherine said softly, and I think he understands that life is too precious to waste on unnecessary waiting. She paused, her expression growing more serious. I won't be here to see you married, Clara. We both know that, but it eases my heart to know you won't be alone after I'm gone. Clara abandoned the bread dough and went to her mother, kneeling beside her chair and taking her thin hands. Mama, don't talk that way. You don't know I do know, Catherine interrupted gently. And so do you. It's all right, Clara. I've made my peace with it. What matters now is that you're taken care of, that you have a chance at happiness. Vaughn Drake can give you that, I believe. Clara blinked back tears, squeezing her mother's hands carefully. I think so too, she whispered. Catherine smiled, reaching out to stroke her daughter's hair. Then that's settled. Now help me up. I want to sit on the porch while the sun's still warm. And don't forget your bread, or we'll all go hungry tonight. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. William was more talkative than usual, asking Vaughn questions about his experiences with cattle and his plans for the future. Thomas and Joseph seemed to watch the interactions with newfound interest, occasionally exchanging glances that suggested they had been informed of Vaughn's formal request. After the meal, when Clara and Vaughn took their customary places on the porch, she turned to him with a raised eyebrow. Were you planning to tell me that you asked my father for permission to court me? Vaughn had the grace to look slightly abashed. I was going to tell you tonight. I wanted to do things properly, respect for your father and all that. Clara couldn't maintain her stern expression in the face of his earnestness. Mama told me this afternoon. She seems quite pleased with the arrangement. And you? Vaughn asked, suddenly serious. Are you pleased, Clara? In answer, she moved closer on the porch step they shared, slipping her hand into his. Very pleased, she assured him. Though I understand we're to wait 6 months before any formal engagement. Vaughn nodded, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of her hand. Your father was very clear about that, and I respect his wishes. 6 months will give us time to be certain, to know each other in all seasons. You'll be back at the Rocking J for most of that time, Clara pointed out, a hint of worry creeping into her voice. I'll ride over every chance I get, Vaughn promised. And I've been thinking the Rocking J isn't so far that I couldn't make the trip in a day if needed. Your father mentioned that old Simmons at the next homestead over is looking to sell come spring. It's good land, with access to water and enough grazing for a decent start. Clara's heart quickened at the implication. You're thinking of buying it? I've saved most of what I've earned these past 5 years, Vaughn confirmed. It wouldn't be much to start with, a small herd, maybe some crops, but it could grow, and it would mean being close to your family. He paused, meeting her eyes directly. Close to you. The enormity of what he was suggesting, not just courting her, but planning a future that would keep them together, that would allow them to build something of their own while remaining connected to her family, overwhelmed Clara. It was more than she had dared to hope for when he'd first spoken of courtship. I think that sounds wonderful, she said finally, her voice soft with emotion. Vaughn's answering smile was bright even in the gathering darkness. Then that's what I'll work toward. A place of our own, close enough to help your father when needed, but ours all the same. He leaned in to kiss her, and Clara met him halfway, her heart full of a happiness she had scarcely allowed herself to imagine before Vaughn Drake had galloped into her life and changed everything. The remaining days of the harvest passed in a golden haze for Clara, golden like the wheat they brought in, golden like the autumn sunlight that bathed the prairie, golden like the hope that filled her heart despite her mother's worsening condition. Vaughn worked alongside her family from dawn until dusk, proving his worth not just to Clara but to William and her brothers as well. In the evenings, after chores were done and dinner cleared away, Vaughn would often read aloud from the book of poetry he had given Clara. These readings became a cherished ritual, with even William setting aside his usual taciturn manner to listen, as Vaughn's deep voice brought Tennyson's words to life in their simple cabin. Catherine particularly enjoyed these readings, her face animated despite her increasing weakness as she listened from her chair by the fire. It was during one such evening, as Vaughn finished reading Ulysses with its stirring final lines about striving, seeking, finding, and not yielding, that Catherine reached for Clara's hand. "That's how you must live," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "Never yield to despair or complacency. Always seek, always strive." Clara squeezed her mother's hand gently, throat tight with emotion. "I will, Mama, I promise." That night, Clara woke to her father's urgent voice calling her name. She knew, even before she reached her parents' bedroom, what had happened. Catherine Wilkins had slipped away peacefully in her sleep. The struggle for breath finally ended, her face serene in the soft light of the lamp William had lit. The days that followed passed in a blur of grief and necessary preparations. Neighbors from miles around came to pay their respects, bringing food and offerings of help for the harvest's final days. The funeral was held in the small church in the nearest town, the simple wooden coffin lowered into Wyoming soil that Catherine had come to love despite, or perhaps because of its harshness. Through it all, Vaughn remained a steady presence at Clara's side, respectful of her family's grief, helpful without being intrusive, offering strength when she needed it and space when she required solitude. He postponed his return to the rocking J, sending word to Jenkins explaining the circumstances, and stayed to help complete the harvest that Catherine had been so anxious to see finished. A week after the funeral, as Clara stood at her mother's grave with fresh wildflowers, the last of the season, she felt Vaughn's approach before she saw him. He stopped a respectful distance away, hat in hand, waiting for a sign that his presence was welcome. Clara turned to him, managing a small smile through her tears. "She would have loved that you read poetry to her in her final days," she said. "It meant everything to her, to all of us." Vaughn stepped closer, his eyes gentle with understanding. "She was a remarkable woman. I wish I could have known her longer." "She knew you would take care of me," Clara said softly. It gave her peace at the end. Vaughn reached for her hand, enfolding it in his own. "I will, Clara, for as long as you'll let me." They stood together at the grave for a long moment, the Wyoming wind rustling the prairie grasses around them, the vast sky overhead a brilliant blue that Catherine had always said reminded her of heaven's promise. "I have to return to the rocking J tomorrow," Vaughn said finally. "Jenkins has been more than understanding, but I gave my word I'd be back for the cattle drive to winter pasture." Clara nodded, having expected this. "When will I see you again?" "3 weeks," Vaughn promised. "Once the herd is settled, Jenkins has agreed to give me a few days. I'll ride straight here." He paused, then added, "And I've spoken to Simmons about his land. He's willing to hold it for me until spring if I can give him a deposit next month." The news brought a genuine smile to Clara's face, the first since her mother's passing. "You're really going to do it?" "By the neighboring homestead." "If you want me to," Vaughn replied, his expression serious. "This is about our future together, Clara. I won't pressure you into anything, especially now when you're grieving." Clara touched his face gently, her heart full despite her sorrow. "My mother's last wish was for me to be happy," she said. "And nothing would make me happier than building a life with you, Vaughn Drake." The kiss they shared beside Catherine's grave was a promise of love that would endure beyond grief, of a future they would create together in this harsh but beautiful land, of memories they would make to honor those who had gone before them. The following morning, Clara stood on the porch as Vaughn prepared to depart. William and her brothers had already said their goodbyes, offering handshakes and words of appreciation for his help during the difficult time. Now it was just the two of them, the early morning light casting long shadows across the yard. 3 weeks, Clara repeated, memorizing his face as if he would be gone for years rather than less than a month. 3 weeks, Vaughn confirmed, adjusting Thunder's saddle one final time. "I'll write if I can find someone heading this way, and I'll be thinking of you every day." Clara stepped closer, straightening his collar in a gesture that felt strangely domestic despite the newness of their relationship. "Be careful on the drive. Cattle can be unpredictable." "So can wild hogs," Vaughn replied with a smile that reached his eyes. "But look how well that turned out." Clara laughed, the sound surprising her after days of grief. "I suppose I should be grateful to those terrible beasts for chasing me into your path." "I know I am," Vaughn said softly. He leaned down to kiss her one last time, then swung up into the saddle with the easy grace that had first caught her attention. "Take care of yourself, Clara Wilkins. I'll be back before you know it." Clara watched him ride away, Thunder's steady gait carrying them across the prairie toward the distant mountains. She stood on the porch long after Vaughn had disappeared from sight, her heart full of a complex mixture of emotions: grief for her mother, longing for Vaughn, and beneath it all, a steadfast hope for the future they would build together. The 3 weeks of Vaughn's absence passed slowly for Clara. She threw herself into the work of preparing for winter, preserving the last of the garden's produce, mending clothes, helping her father and brothers repair the cabin and outbuildings before the first snow. In the evenings, she often read from the book of poetry Vaughn had given her, finding comfort in the words they had shared during those golden harvest days. William was quieter than ever following Catherine's death, but Clara occasionally caught him watching her with a softness in his gaze that spoke of his concern for her happiness. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he surprised her by mentioning Vaughn directly. "Drake's a good man," he said, the words coming out gruffly as if he were unused to offering such assessments. "Works hard, thinks before he speaks, knows his way around animals and land." "Yes, he does," Clara agreed, setting aside her mending to look at her father. William nodded, seemingly satisfied with her response. "Your mother liked him, said he had kind eyes." He paused, then added, "She was right about that, as she was about most things." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at this rare acknowledgement of her mother's wisdom. She was. "Simmons came by today," William continued, changing the subject slightly. "Says Drake sent word about buying his place in the spring. Wanted to know if I had any objections to having him as a neighbor." Clara's heart quickened. "What did you tell him?" William puffed on his pipe for a moment before answering. "Told him I'd rather have Drake working that land than some greenhorn from back east who doesn't know one end of a cow from the other." He glanced at Clara, the ghost of a smile crossing his weathered face. "Also told him I'd appreciate having my daughter close by once she's married." Clara crossed the room to kneel beside her father's chair, taking his rough hand in hers. "Thank you, Pa," she whispered. William squeezed her hand awkwardly, unused to such demonstrations of affection. "Your mother would want you to be happy," he said simply. "So do I." 3 weeks to the day after Vaughn's departure, Clara was in the yard gathering eggs when she heard the now familiar sound of Thunder's gate. She looked up to see Vaughn approaching, his figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Without thinking, she set down her basket of eggs and ran to meet him, propriety forgotten in her joy at his return. Vaughn dismounted quickly, catching her in his arms as she reached him. For a long moment, they simply held each other, the weeks of separation falling away as if they had never been. "You're here," Clara said finally, drawing back to look at him. He was thinner than when he'd left, his face more weathered from the cattle drive, but his eyes were as warm and blue as she remembered. "As promised," Vaughn replied, smiling down at her. The drive was successful, got the herd to winter pasture with minimal losses despite an early snowstorm in the high country. Clara frowned, reaching up to touch a fresh cut along his jawline. "And this?" Vaughn caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Just a disagreement with a tree branch during the storm. Nothing serious." Clara wasn't entirely convinced, suspecting there was more to the story, but she let it pass, too happy at his return to dwell on what might have happened during his absence. "Come inside," she urged, picking up her abandoned egg basket. "Pa and the boys will want to hear about the drive, and I've made apple pie." As they walked toward the cabin, Vaughn's hand found hers naturally, their fingers intertwining as if they'd been doing it for years rather than weeks. "I spoke with Simmons again," he told her. "Everything's arranged for the spring. I've given him a deposit, and Jenkins has agreed to let me go with his blessing and a few head of cattle as a starting herd." Clara squeezed his hand, joy bubbling up inside her. "It's really happening, then?" "You'll have your own land." "We will," Vaughn corrected gently. "If you still want that." Clara stopped, turning to face him fully. "I do," she said simply, "more than anything." The months that followed established a pattern that would carry them through the winter. Vaughn divided his time between the Rocking J Ranch and the Wilkins homestead, spending 2 weeks at his job, and then riding to spend 3 or 4 days with Clara and her family. During these visits, he would help with whatever work needed doing, chopping wood, repairing fences damaged by winter storms, hunting to supplement their stored provisions. In the evenings, they would sit together by the fire, sometimes reading, sometimes talking of their plans for the future, sometimes simply enjoying each other's presence after the days apart. Occasionally, when William and the boys were occupied elsewhere, they would share moments of greater intimacy, kisses that grew deeper and more passionate as their relationship developed, embraces that left them both breathless and longing for the day when they could be truly together. Christmas came, the first without Catherine. Clara decorated the cabin with pine boughs and handmade ornaments as her mother had always done, determined to honor traditions while creating new ones. Vaughn arrived on Christmas Eve with gifts for everyone: a new pipe for William, hunting knives for Thomas and Joseph, and for Clara, a simple silver ring. "It's not an engagement ring," he explained as he slipped it onto her right hand, mindful of William's 6-month waiting period. "Not yet. But it's a promise that when the time comes, I'll have one for your left hand." Clara treasured the ring and the promise it represented, wearing it proudly as the winter progressed and spring began to make its tentative appearance on the Wyoming landscape. The 6 months William had stipulated passed, marked by Vaughn's steady courtship and his increasing integration into the Wilkins family. On a mild day in early April, with the first wildflowers beginning to appear on the prairie, Vaughn arrived at the homestead with more than his usual saddlebags. A wagon followed behind him, driven by Mr. Jenkins himself, loaded with furniture, tools, and supplies. "Thought you could use some help getting settled." Jenkins explained to Vaughn as they unloaded the wagon at the Simmons place, now officially Vaughn's property. "Consider it a wedding present if that's where this is heading." Vaughn shook his former employer's hand gratefully. "It is indeed, if the lady will have me." Jenkins glanced at Clara, who had come to help with the unloading. "I'd say that's a foregone conclusion, judging by the way she's looking at you." Clara blushed, but didn't deny the observation. Her anticipation had been building for days, ever since Vaughn had sent word that he would be arriving to take possession of his new property. Now, seeing him standing on land that would be their home, she could scarcely contain her happiness. The cabin on Vaughn's property was smaller than the Wilkins homestead, but solidly built. Simmons had maintained it well, and with Jenkins's unexpected gifts of furniture, a bed, a table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair, and various kitchen implements, it quickly began to feel like a real home. That evening, after Jenkins had departed with promises to visit once they were settled, Vaughn took Clara for a walk around the property. The setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and pink, reminiscent of the autumn days when they had first fallen in love. "It needs work," Vaughn acknowledged as they surveyed the fields that would need planting, the fences that required mending, the barn that could use a fresh coat of paint. "But it's ours, or it will be." Clara squeezed his hand. "I love it already." They stopped at the edge of the property, where a small creek marked the boundary between Vaughn's land and her father's. From this vantage point, they could see both homesteads, the established Wilkins place and their new beginning. Vaughn turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "6 months have passed," he said simply. Clara nodded, her heart racing. "They have." "I spoke with your father this morning," Vaughn continued. "Asked him formally for your hand in marriage." "And what did he say?" Clara asked, though she could guess the answer from Vaughn's expression. "He said it was about time I made an honest woman of you, considering I've been riding over here every chance I get for half a year," Vaughn replied with a smile. Then his expression grew serious as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "Clara Wilkins, from the moment I pulled you onto my saddle with those wild hogs at our heels, I knew you were someone special. These past months have only confirmed what my heart recognized instantly, that you are the woman I want to spend my life with, to build a home with, to face whatever challenges the frontier throws at us together." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small diamond that caught the light of the setting sun. "Will you marry me?" Clara didn't hesitate, not even for a moment. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, Vaughn Drake, I will marry you." Vaughn slipped the ring onto her left hand, where it nestled perfectly beside the silver promise ring she still wore on her right. Then he pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the love, passion, and promise that words alone couldn't express. As they walked back toward the cabin hand in hand, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, Clara thought of her mother. Catherine would have loved this moment, would have been planning the wedding already, fussing over details and giving advice. The pang of her absence was sharp but no longer debilitating. "Mama would be so happy," she said softly. Vaughn's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I like to think she knows somehow that she's watching over us." Clara leaned into his embrace, comforted by the thought. "I think so too." The wedding took place in June, when the prairie was in full bloom, wildflowers dotting the landscape in a riot of colors that would have delighted Catherine. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her smaller frame, with a crown of fresh flowers in her hair. Vaughn stood tall and handsome in a new suit, his usual cowboy hat replaced for the occasion with a more formal one that Thomas teased him about mercilessly. The ceremony was held outdoors, between the two homesteads, with neighbors from miles around gathering to witness the union. William gave his daughter away with a dignity that barely masked his emotion, and Jenkins stood as Vaughn's best man. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed the entire county. As the sun began to set, casting the same golden light that had illuminated their first days together, Vaughn led Clara away from the festivities toward their cabin, their home. They walked in comfortable silence, both aware of the significance of the moment, of the life they were beginning together. At the threshold, Vaughn stopped and turned to Clara with a smile that made her heart skip. "Mrs. Drake," he said, the new name still strange but wonderful to her ears. "I believe there's a tradition to uphold here." Before she could respond, he had swept her into his arms, cradling her against his chest much as he had on that fateful day when wild hogs had chased her across the prairie and into his life. Clara laughed in delight as he carried her over the threshold and into their home, setting her gently on her feet in the main room that they had prepared together over the past weeks. "Welcome home," Vaughn said softly, framing her face with his hands. "Home," Clara repeated, the word filled with promise. "Wherever you are, that's home to me now." Their kiss was a beginning of their marriage, of their life together on the Wyoming frontier, of a love story that had started with danger and rescue, but would continue through all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that lay ahead. Outside, the celebration continued, but within the walls of their small cabin, Clara and Vaughn created their own private celebration, a joining of bodies and souls that sealed the promises they had made before God and their community. In Vaughn's tender touch, Clara found a passion that matched her own, a devotion that would weather whatever storms might come their way. As they lay together in the quiet aftermath, Vaughn's heart beat steady beneath her cheek. Clara thought again of her mother's words. Never yield to despair or complacency. Always seek, always strive. In the circle of Vaughn's arms, with the future stretching before them like the vast Wyoming prairie, challenging but full of possibility, Clara knew she would honor that advice. Together, they would seek, strive, find, and never yield to anything but love. 5 years later, Clara stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching as Vaughn taught their 4-year-old son, William, named for her father, how to ride his first pony. Their 2-year-old daughter, Catherine, played at Clara's feet, arranging pebbles in patterns that made sense only to her. Clara's hand rested on her swollen belly, where their third child grew stronger each day. The homestead had flourished under their care. Fields of wheat and corn stretched toward the horizon. Cattle grazed on the rolling hills, and the orchard they had planted in their first year was beginning to bear fruit. The small creek that divided their property from her father's had been bridged, creating a physical connection between the two homesteads that matched the familial bonds that remained strong. William Wilkins still lived in the family home, though Thomas had married and built his own place on the eastern section of the original property. Joseph had surprised them all by going east to study medicine, inspired by his mother's illness and the frontier's desperate need for doctors. As Clara watched her family, the one she had been born to, and the one she had created with Vaughn, she marveled at how life's most frightening moments could lead to its greatest joys. Had those wild hogs not chased her that summer day, had Vaughn not happened to be tracking them, had he not fired those 2 crucial shots and pulled her onto his saddle, none of this would exist. "What are you thinking about?" Vaughn asked, coming up the porch steps after settling young William safely on his pony with strict instructions to stay within the fenced yard. "Wild hogs," Clara replied with a smile, leaning into his embrace as his arms circled her and their unborn child. Vaughn laughed, the sound as warm and comforting to her now as it had been the first time she heard it. Strange thing to be contemplating on such a fine day. Not really, Clara said, turning in his arms to face him. I was just thinking how grateful I am that they chased me into your path. Vaughn's expression softened as he understood her meaning. He placed a gentle hand on her rounded belly, where their child kicked in response to his touch. I think about that day often, he admitted. How different everything would be if I'd been hunting in another direction, or if you'd run toward home instead of across the open prairie. But you weren't, and I didn't, Clara said simply. And now we have all this. Vaughn's kiss was as tender as his first had been, yet filled with the deeper understanding that comes from years of shared life, shared struggles, shared joys. When they parted, his blue eyes still as vibrant as the Wyoming sky held hers with a love that had only grown stronger with time. And we always will, he promised. As their children played in the yard of the home they had built together, as the sun shone down on the land they had nurtured, as life stirred within her, Clara knew that promise was one they would keep together always.